Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Melissa and today I am trying out basket weaving. So I got a beginner kit from basketweaving.com. They actually have an Etsy shop and that's where I got it, so I will link that in the description. And I am doing the Colonial Basket Kit, which it has a picture of what it's supposed to look like in that corner. Which I chose just because it seemed like a pretty small, manageable project because I didn't obviously want anything too complicated, and I really don't anticipate with this necessarily getting into basket weaving as far as doing it really any more than the length of this video. I just kind of want to get an idea of what goes into it. Okay, so here's what the kit came with. It came with the instructions, and then it came with the reed, which is all tied together. I think there's a few different sizes, or a couple different sizes here, and then this handle for the basket. And right away after reading the instructions, I have questions. It does say here that you're supposed to work with wet reed, because if it is dry, it tends to break and split. But it doesn't tell me if I'm supposed to soak it before or after I cut it into the size pieces that I need. So I guess I'm going to undo this and then see how it feels, I guess, before probably going and looking it up. So my inclination is to just cut it dry, but I also don't want to be wrong about this, so I guess I'm going to go look that up. Okay, so I didn't find what I felt like was a really clear answer to this question, though I did find a YouTube tutorial where the lady was showing it, and she did cut the reeds first and then soak them, so I'm going to go with that. It makes more sense to me that way anyway, because I don't see a point in soaking all of this if I'm not going to need it all right now. I'm going to start with that. According to this, I need 5 pieces at 20 inches long and 6 pieces at 17 inches long, and this is of the 1/2 inch wide reed. So let me double check and make sure that's what I have. Yep. And I'm assuming that I should probably cut off this spot here that's kind of coming apart. So 20 inches is there. That's my 5 at 20 inches, and now I need 6 at 17 inches. So these reeds that I am cutting are going to be what are called the spokes of the basket, which basically form the base. And once I had all of them cut out, I stuck them in a tub of water to soak for 20 to 30 minutes. And while those were soaking, I also cut 2 more 1/2 inch reeds at 22 and 24 inches. And I did not soak these because they weren't going to be used until later. These have soaked for about 20 minutes, which is how long they're supposed to sit. And I'm just going to go ahead and take all of them out. I think it's like a 20 to 30 minute window for soaking, but since I'm going to be working, I don't want to leave anything in and forget about it. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull it all out and put it on a towel. Now I can start the actual weaving. The directions say to put the handle up and take a 20-inch reed I got these all mixed up, so now I'm going to have to measure it again. And it said there is a right side and a wrong side to these, so like there's a more rough side and then a smoother side, and the rough side needs to go in to the basket, and it's supposed to be centered on it. This mat might actually come in handy for that. So that's number one, and the directions show a weight, they call it a spoke weight, holding this in place. Didn't come with one, didn't say really what I was supposed to use, so I'm just using this, it's just scrap fabric stuffed with glass beads. So I believe at this point I am starting to kind of weave, because you're adding, as you add in both directions, they do have to weave in and out of each other. So these new ones have to go under the basket handle and over the other two. I have a feeling the hardest part of this is going to be constantly trying to work around that handle, because of course it's not dampened, it's not supposed to be dampened or wet, and it is very hard, and so everything has to kind of bend around it. At least that's how it seems. So I just continued weaving these spokes together to form the base, and the working around the handle, mainly going under the handle when I had to weave under it, was the hardest part, just because it's so stiff, and it was hard to like pick up the whole thing, because since I'm trying to hold all of those other reeds in place, there wasn't a lot of options for getting things around it. But once I had all of the pieces woven in place, I measured it to make sure they were in the spread out correctly. I actually had packed them in too tight and had to spread them out a bit to get them in the proper measurements. And then I wove a piece of yarn around it and tied it to hold it in place. That's what the directions called for. And at some point as I was doing this, I did put my 1/4 inch reed into the water to start soaking for the next step. Okay, so I have the base done. Basically this is filled out from here, and then it said to fasten it with yarn, or like those specific things that I think are typical basket making supplies that could be used, but I didn't have any of that, so I just used yarn, which was one of the suggestions, and basically that's holding it in place. And now it's time to start weaving up the sides, but first I need to split one of these reeds. This is the spoke on the end with 5 spokes. 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's this one here. And this is to maintain that over-under pattern that will start going on as I start weaving. Everything still feels pretty damp, but I think I am going to kind of soak each side a little bit while my other reed finishes soaking. The directions do say not to get the handle wet, which I am very curious, how am I supposed to manage that as everything starts getting woven in together, but I guess I will figure that out as I go. So I am ready to start weaving. So the instructions say to start over here on this end with the split piece, and to turn everything up so that it's at a right angle with the bottom of the basket. So as I started weaving, the hardest part was definitely the first few rows and trying to get those sides to start going straight up and down like they were supposed to. After the first couple of rows, it started getting a little easier as far as that goes. The other thing that I did when I first started was I was trying to crease a really sharp turn at the corners. But as I went, I kind of stopped doing that and started just kind of letting the reed kind of naturally curve. And I do like the look of that better than those sharp corners that I had at the beginning. And I did find that the time it took for me to work through one strand of the 1/4 inch reed was about the time I needed to soak the next one. So when I would pull one out, I would just put a new one in, or at least that's what I tried to do as I went along. And I did find that it was sometimes easier to adjust, at least for me, the rows kind of after I had moved away from it a bit. So for example, if I'm working on one long side, I would work the short side before going back to that long side to push everything down, or even just do it a few rows later, because there was more just to hold it in place. And again, much like weaving the base, trying to weave around the handle was the hardest part because it's so stiff, and also because I found that when I was weaving, it was easiest to kind of bring the weaver, which was the 1/4 inch reed, up and just kind of push it back and forth and manipulate the spokes to get it in, rather than trying to pull the weaver through all of those pieces. But of course, with the handle, I couldn't do that because it's curved and it's completely closed. So the weaving is done on all of the sides, and now I need to trim these spokes. And these ones here that are already behind that top row need to be trimmed even, and these need to be left longer because they're going to be folded and tucked under. After trimming down every other spoke, I took the remaining ones and trimmed them down a little, but not even with the top of the weaving. And then these were called to be scored and then folded over and tucked under some of the rows of weaving on the inside of the basket. This footage isn't really all that great because this was a very fiddly step, and I kept having to really lean over to see inside and see what I was doing. And while I was working on this, I did soak the other two pieces of the 1/2 inch reed that I cut all the way back at the beginning of this process. And these are the rims of the basket. They go on the top edge, one on the inside and one on the outside of the basket, to cover all of those raw edges. So once they finished soaking, I clipped them in place. Now they weren't long enough to actually go all the way around the basket like they were supposed to and then overlap, and I think that's because I didn't pull my weaving tight enough at the last few rows as I was doing the sides, so the top of my basket was wider than it was probably supposed to be. The next step was lashing these rims on. This was done with another piece of 1/4 inch reed, and it started by pulling it halfway through so that I had half on either side of the basket, one outside and one inside, and then had kind of a fancy cross around the handle before going in almost in a way like a whip stitch motion. If I was sewing is probably what I would almost consider it, along. And what this was supposed to do was to catch the rims on both the inside and the outside of the basket. Now I did end up having to pull this out a couple of times. The first time because I really wasn't getting, I don't think, the reed through properly. I think I was leaving too much space in between as I was pulling it through, and then also because I kept somehow not catching the inner rim, so I kept having to pull it out so that I could go back and redo it and make sure I actually looped around that inner rim and caught it so that it wouldn't come apart. And the directions I found weren't that specific on what to do with the ends of the pieces. It explained how to start from a new piece of reed as I was weaving up the sides, when one piece would end, and how to start a new piece. But it didn't really say, well, what do I do with the end of the first piece where I started, and what do I do with the end of the last piece where I finished. And so I kind of just tucked those in behind some of the previous weaving and then clipped those corners or edges that were left. And I did the same for the reed that I used to lash on the rims. So here it is all finished. I did do this in one day. It was a small-ish project. And the main reason I chose to do it that way is because since everything had to be soaked and was supposed to be wet or at least damp when working with it, but at the same time, the instructions said not to get the handle wet. And I kind of felt like once the base was in, that was going to be very hard if I had to stop and then come back and soak everything again. To really do that, because everything soaks for like 20 minutes. So even if you say, okay, I'll soak this side, well, this side's sitting unsoaked. So then you have to flip it and soak this side. And I feel like in the 20 minutes that it would take for one side to soak, the other side's just going to dry out. I didn't want to have to worry about that, so I just made sure I had a day when I could completely focus on this without too much interruption. And I do think that it turned out really well. When I first decided that I wanted to try basket weaving, I wasn't sure how it would go because I've done some weaving and I kind of felt like as far as that was going to go, wouldn't be too hard. I had experience in that area, but I wasn't sure about the rest of it. And I did find that once it came to kind of having to shape things as I was working up the sides, it got a lot harder, and that was when I started having doubts about how this would turn out. But I mean, it is a completely usable basket, so I think it turned out pretty well in that regard. I did notice that it's a little crooked on these long sides. I don't know if it's going to come up on the camera very well, but it kind of sticks out and then dips in and then goes back out as you go towards the corners. But regardless of how it looks, it is perfectly functional, and I do anticipate getting a lot of use out of it over the summer once the garden starts coming in, because even though it's a small basket, it will be very good for holding some of the smaller stuff if I want to keep it separated out. And my comment earlier about only doing this one project with basket weaving, I may have to retract that because I do have some leftover reed, and I did actually enjoy this quite a bit more than I expected. Thank you for watching, and I hope you will join me next week for another handmade happening.